Hello everyone, my name's Steve and welcome back to American Steam Legacy. The history of steam railroading is full of examples of locomotive designs evolving due to continuous improvement or an entirely new concept being introduced that breaks ranks with the conventional wisdom. When Matthias Forney introduced his design, it probably drew comments such as, "But I thought this was the front end," and "What do you mean it doesn't need a pilot truck?" But what Forney came up with was conventional in most regards, it was just arranged a little differently. So we're going to get into what was Mr. Forney thinking coming up next on American Steam Legacy. Matthias Forney, the inventor of the locomotive that bears his name, was a rather accomplished figure in 19th century railroading. He was a prolific inventor with no less than 6 U.S. patents to his name. He became a published author in 1874 with the Catechism of the Locomotive, which would become regarded as an authoritative work on late 19th century locomotive construction. Forney would also become a founding member of the American Society of Mechanical Engineers and worked extensively with the Master Car Builders Association. In the early 1850s, Forney apprenticed under noted locomotive builder Ross Winans. Winans was, by most accounts, a rather unpleasant character, so having survived what I'm sure was a bit of an ordeal is yet another feather in Forney's cap. The impetus for Forney's design came from the need to rectify what he saw as shortcomings of typical locomotive design practices. The first shortcoming is the percentage of locomotive weight carried on the pilot truck. In his 1866 patent, Forney freely acknowledges the need for non-powered leading wheels, but he felt the weight carried on those wheels could be put to better use elsewhere, specifically as adhesive weight carried on the drive wheels. Forney began with a continuous frame that ran the length of the locomotive. The boiler, firebox, and smoke box were placed at one end, and the water tank at the other, with the cab more or less in the center. The intent was to have the weight of the boiler and smoke box carried entirely by the drive wheels. The weight of the steam chests and valve gear would help counterbalance the firebox, resulting in a more even weight distribution on the two driven axles. Forney went on to state that 6 or even 8 drive wheels could be employed, but since maximizing the axle loading on the driven wheels was the goal, he felt 4 was ideal. Forney's next objective was to eliminate the need for a tender, which he described as dead weight that consumed too much of the engine's power that could be better used elsewhere, like moving a train. This meant the fuel and water supply would have to be carried on the locomotive itself. To accommodate the fuel and water, Forney took a novel approach, perhaps more so with the fuel than with the water. A supply of coal was to be carried in a coal bunker that straddled the firebox, with the firebox shell shaped in such a way to maximize the space available. Water was to be carried in a water tank placed above the four-wheeled truck supporting the other end of the frame. If desired, the location of the coal bunker and water tank could be reversed. So at this point, we can't help but wonder, what's the big deal? This is nothing more than a 044T tank engine that is to be operated like any other steam locomotive, boiler first. Well, not exactly. Forney intended his locomotive to be operated water tank first rather than boiler first when traveling forward. One of the claimed benefits of this arrangement is boiler efficiency. Since the draft through the boiler is moving in the opposite direction of travel, the draft is increased, improving boiler efficiency by reducing fuel consumption. Since the draft is now being induced rather than forced by the partial vacuum in the smoke box, the exhaust nozzle can be enlarged, reducing cylinder back pressure. With the cab now located ahead of the boiler, the possibility of smoke from the stack entering the cab is also eliminated. A fully enclosed and weather-tight cab could also be used while maintaining easy access to the coal bunker. Since the locomotive is essentially running cab forward, what would have been the trailing truck is now serving as the pilot and providing the same benefit when negotiating curves. And with the boiler and smokestack behind the cab, the engineer has an unobstructed view of the track ahead. However, the visibility over the boiler was reasonable due to the width of the cab and the modest girth of the boiler. One of Forney's main objectives was to keep the adhesive weight on the drive wheels constant. His design could have included a saddle tank or wing tanks flanking the boiler. When these tanks are full, they would have increased the weight on the drive wheels, but this benefit would have soon dissipated as the water supply was consumed. There is at least one example of a Forney equipped with a saddle tank. It was built by Burnham, Parry and Williams Company in 1903 for the Elk River Mill and Lumber Company in California. By the year 1900, over 500 Forneys had been built and sold around the world, with the 1890s seeing peak production. Since the Forney typically had an adhesion factor well above 4, They earned the nickname Little Giant. The Forney was built to a variety of gauges ranging from 20 to 60 inches, but nearly 80% of the units produced were built to the American standard gauge of 4 feet 8.5 inches. No fewer than 10 manufacturers produced the Forney, with Burnham, Parry and Williams Company accounting for 174 built between 1879 and 1912. The narrow gauge Forneys typically weighed in at 58,000 pounds or less and developed at most 9,700 pounds of tractive effort. The largest standard gauge units could weigh in as much as 130,000 pounds and develop 15,500 pounds of tractive effort. The Central Wharf Railroad in Boston, Massachusetts operated one of the smallest Forneys. In 1884, the railroad built 5 20-inch gauge examples that rode on 12-inch drive wheels. At the other end of the spectrum was the Chesapeake and Ohio, which operated 2 1889 Schenectady-built Forneys weighing 110,000 pounds and riding on 57-inch drivers. The one constant, at least among Forneys operating in the U.S., was the valve gear. The Stephenson type and slide valves were used almost to the exclusion of all others in the United States. However, the type could be found using Walschaerts valve gear elsewhere around the world. While the Forney was used in the logging and mining industries, as well as on plantations and steel mills, the largest fleets of the type were operated by elevated commuter railroads in Chicago, New York, and Boston. The Forney was well suited for this type of service. Its short wheelbase allowed it to negotiate sharp curves found on most elevated lines of the period, and its power meant that it could keep a consist of commuter cars moving at a respectable speed of 13 miles per hour. The largest operator of Forneys was by far the Manhattan Railway Company. With lines serving Manhattan and the Bronx, the line rostered 277 Forneys built between 1878 and 1885. The most unusual Forneys could be found operating on the Chicago and South Side Rapid Transit. In 1892, the line took delivery of 46 locomotives from Burnham, Parry, and Williams that were double expansion compounds. The first 45 were four-cylinder Vauclane compounds, and the 46th was a two-cylinder cross compound. Since the city of Chicago was already considering banning the use of steam locomotives in the downtown area, the Vauclane compounds were designed to burn anthracite coal to reduce smoke and prevent the locomotive from throwing cinders from its stack. The locomotives and cars were equipped with drip pans to collect oil, and the locomotive's ash pans and fireboxes featured a water quench system. The Vauclane compounds also featured an intercept valve that would allow live steam to enter all four cylinders, enhancing power when starting a train. The two-cylinder cross compound didn't survive in its original configuration for very long. Shortly after its arrival, it was found that it couldn't compete with the Vauclane compounds, even though it was identical in all other aspects. The cross compound was converted to a single expansion and went into service as a yard switcher. The service life of all 46 locomotives was cut short when the system began to switch over to electric motive power in 1898. The fleet was eventually sold off to other railroads around the country, with 10 going to New York to pull elevated trains across the Brooklyn Bridge. The Forneys that operated on urban commuter lines fell out of favor, either due to electrification or the elevated and street-level lines being replaced by subways in the first decade of the 20th century. If electrification didn't kill off the Forney in New York, the Kaufman Act of 1923 most certainly would have. The Kaufman Act banned all steam locomotives from operating within the city. Today, 24 Forneys are known to exist. While most are on static display, there are a few still operating. The Disneyland Railroad in Anaheim, California operates 2 locomotives that were originally built as Forneys, but were converted to 2 44T Boston types. Number 3, named the Fred Gurley, was built by Baldwin in 1894, and number 5, the Ward Kimball, was also built by Baldwin in 1902.